and so cultural competence and all of this. And that was one of the missions of these ethnic schools, these storefront schools. As an example, not way back when, let's say in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, but if you look at the late 60s and early 70s, and you look at the Black Panther movement, and one of the education agenda of the Black Panther movement really was the equivalent of culture responsive teaching for African Americans. You know, a lot of times we won't go there to examine that because of the kind of value orientations that we have toward the Black Panther Party, and we want to dismiss them as kind of radical lunatics, and all they wanted to was kill up people, especially kill up white people. Well, maybe a few did, but that wasn't the whole agenda. So we looked at that. There's another kind of an element. I know more about the African American experience than other ethnic groups. But if you trace back to the African American experience, there's always been a lineage in that education history of some elements of what are the equivalent of culture responsive teaching. So if we stop for a moment at Mary McLeod Bethune, does that name ring any bells to anybody? Good. I saw two people. It's so good that not just a black woman in class. There's I don't know if you're a brother or not, but you know, you're with us. Yeah. So next I saw two women and a man shaking their head. Are those dreads you're working on? Nothing wrong with that at all. But if you look at Mary McLeod Bethune, and when you get on the inside of her creating an education institution, initially for girls, especially girls beyond the primary grades, and then that gradually moved into a college that became Bethune, first Bethune College, and now it's Bethune-Cookman University. You don't need to worry about how that came to be historically. But again, if we were to look at that educational agenda, there would be some evidence of an attempt to culture responsive teaching. Probably the most famous document that she left, curiously enough, is My Last Will and Testament. And what she does in that piece then is, in a sense, create an edict for the education of African American children. But she speaks to, this is what I leave to my children. And what she leaves in that metaphorical will could indeed be thought of as some of the content or the elements of a culture responsive educational agenda. So you can kind of keep doing that. You know, when you look at W.B. Du Bois, when he writes about, and Du Bois is writing at the turn, most of what he's known for is at the turn of the 20th century. So he's writing, you know, like in 1898, in 1905, and things like that, like The Souls of My Foe. He also wrote a book called The Souls of White Folks. He was an equal opportunity scholar, kind of like that. But even when, if I say Booker T. Washington, you know that name and you know the tension that folks are talking about between Booker T and W.E.B. But when you look carefully at what Booker T. Washington was proposing, it was a culture responsive kind of thing that was nested in economic reality of those times. So a lot of folks want to argue about Booker T that said, oh, he just wanted black folks to not develop their minds, just to be farmers. But the man was a farmer. And he was writing out of Alabama and all of that. What were black folks doing, you know, in the early 20th century? You know, we weren't flying airplanes. We were hoeing cotton, you know, and all of that kind of stuff. So in that sense, Booker T was suggesting an educational agenda that was contextually appropriate for the location, the audience, and the time and place. And culture responsive teaching has a strong element of the notion that whatever and however we're going to teach diverse populations, they need to, those specific elements need to be contextually appropriate. Or if as I was saying, that there's a strong feature in culture responsive teaching of locality. That if your stuff has to be specific to the locality. If you continue to talk in generalized ways and don't translate that to a particular, whether it's setting or population or age group, then you haven't quite gotten to culture responsive teaching. So those are some of the kind of stuff to say that there are as well. Usually I don't read anything that I write once it's published. Why bother? There are too many other things to read. And then I might not like what is published once it's, so just not leave it alone. There's some other kinds of things too that's kind of idiosyncratic foolishness, but nonetheless you don't want to know that yet. But for some reason about, not long ago, maybe a year, 2 years ago, I was stumbling in my own body of work for some reason. And I ran across my first publication, which was when I was a graduate student at the University of Texas in Austin. And while I forgot what I used now. It was culturally something. It wasn't responsive. But the message was the same. And I thought, my goodness, I thought in 2010, I was being original. And there I was at the kind of stuff. So in some ways, I guess the moral of the message there is that in many ways, if you were to follow the developmental lineage of scholars that are working and trying to deal with issues of equity and excellence, you may indeed find the equivalent of threads of cultural responsive teaching in a lot of those kind of things. As long as you're not, don't get caught up with just the language itself, the nomenclature, but look for the essence, if you will. And just kind of to say a little bit about that, the nomenclature. There are all different kinds of people that are writing this, and we use different kind of language, but the essence of our message is pretty much the same. Whether it's culturally syncopation, or whether it's culturally responsive, or culturally relevant, or culturally maintenance. One of my students mentioned to me at the beginning of this quarter, she wanted to know how I felt about some scholar criticizing me in using cultural responsiveness, because that scholar was arguing that cultural maintenance was the more appropriate kind of term. And I thought, why should I get excited about that? I don't care what he uses, as long as he doesn't try to make me use his language. But the bigger issue is there really that much of a difference? There are some nuanced differences. There are differences in areas of concentration and emphasis. But if people are trying to converge on this phenomena that we're trying to work with from different perspectives and different places, we ought to be happy for that, rather than trying to find someone and everybody to mimic everybody else. That in itself would violate what cultural responsive teaching is about. So that's kind of some of the stuff. The other kind of issue I would say, just kind of sort of rambling over this. By the way, if you want me, I'll debrief myself of how I'm functioning to give you a training exercise on how Black folks function without stereotyping. What you smiling so? We have a thing going on non-verbally here. One of the things is that in some ways some people in education have been working at this phenomenon a long time. A lot of historical people that I talked to you about really were not educators per se. That is coming out of teacher education, colleges of education. For example, Du Bois was not by training. By training was not an educator, but by advocation became all that kind of stuff. But there are, when you look at the way education issues gain leverage, very often is because of the influence of some bodies outside of education. So a contemporary example is, if educators were doing the Common Core, you would not have all the press around the Common Core right now. There's just something about U.S. society that just don't seem to trust us and respect us as educators. But let somebody outside, some forces outside of the education community begin to take on our issues and argument, and then it gains credibility and influence within education. So in some ways, that may indeed be beginning to happen with cultural responsive teaching. So educators have been talking about this for a while now, and the equivalent of it. But in the last, I would say in the last decade, cultural responsiveness has gone virtual, I guess, kind of stuff. But I'm going to use that metaphorically rather than literally. I mean, it's all over the place. Not only just in the United States, the world. And I use my own campus in the area that I work in at University of Washington. We have a PhD in multicultural education and cultural responsibility is the thread of that. And in the last, it's been curious to watch over the last 5 years how our demographics among graduate students have shifted. Up to the point of last year, during our admissions cycle for new candidates for PhD program, we have a relatively small program. We only have 2 people in that program itself, and then a couple of people kind of off to the college. We had maybe 35, 36 applicants, and of those, only 4 were from the United States. Amazing. And the parts of the world that they're coming from is even more amazing. So these are parts of the world we used to think were monoracial, monoethnic, and monocultural. The 2 countries that are giving us most, sending us our graduate students are China and South Korea. And at first I want to say, what are Chinese students coming up in here talking about? Cultural responsive education. What you going to do with it? Stuff like that. But then, and I'm learning a lot. There are 56 ethnic groups in China. Now, those 55 of those 56 only count for, I'm told, about 4% of the population. But 4% of 1.4 billion people, that's a heap of people that could probably populate your state with some leftover.